Welcome, everyone, global citizens, friends, distant cousins. I'm Marc Buckley, and this is Inside Ideas, a video podcast that we will be distributing all over in conjunction with 1.5 Media and Innovators Magazine. Today, I have a real special treat. Carolyn Steele is here with me, as you can see. Welcome, Carolyn, to the show. I want to give just a brief introduction of Carolyn. Carolyn is obviously a leading thinker on food and cities, and has a book on the market since 2008, Hungry City, Food Shapes Our Lives. Wonderful book. And I first, she has it probably right there. Wonderful book, Hungry City.
That's the first ever copy. So
it's just a small read, it's nothing, it's just in biblical proportions, but I digested it fast. And a new book that maybe she has a copy close by. If not, I have one here as well. I don't know if it can be seen that properly, but Sitopia, there we go. We're bombarding Sitopia. I'll let Carolyn explain a little bit more as we get into some questions. It'll just come out naturally, but Sitopia is a food place, and she'll give you this. She's great at creating new languages and words and meanings out of life. But Carolyn studied architecture at Cambridge University, and is currently still with Kilburn Nightingale Architects, and has a unique journey throughout her life to the point where she started writing about food and collaborating with or combining food and cities and living and architecture together, and kind of is a real systems thinker and a thought leader around these things. And maybe we can get her to show us one of her sketches real quick of how she thinks and puts things together, or to describe that visually for us, for those of us who are just hearing the podcast. But I immediately ordered her book the moment it came out, Sitopia, How Food Can Save the World, and devoured it. And it is absolutely wonderful. And I wanted to get with her today and just have kind of a deep dive dialogue discussion that we could exchange with each other, and maybe give you an insight to our craziness and what led us to this point, and some of the thoughts that we have around food and the world and this 21st century vision. And by the way, Carolyn was also given in 2009 a wonderful TED Talk, a real TED Talk, not a TEDx. And she's also been named by the Ecologist magazine as one of our 21st century visionaries. And I totally agree with it. Not only is she an eloquent speaker and leader, but a wonderful person. I'm so excited and glad to have you here. Welcome. If I have forgotten anything, please forgive me. And if there's anything you'd like to add to that, now's your chance before we begin.
No, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and delight. And no, that was a wonderful introduction. So I don't think I need to add anything further. I think we can just leap into the conversation, but thanks so much.
Great. So we originally met and had a discussion on a bus on the way to the Barilla 9th International Forum on Food and Nutrition. And it stuck with me. And I'm so glad that we had that opportunity and that chance to cross paths. Since that time, you told me at that time that you were working on a new book, and that it was quite a work in progress. It had been something you've been working on for years. But could you bring me up to speed from that point to now, what your journey and what's been going on in your life?
Yes, I mean, it's been a very interesting period for me, because I think food for me has been a kind of one of those light bulb moments in life that it's very much before and after. And for me, the light bulb moment came in the year 2000. Before that, I was working as an architect, so actually building buildings, but also teaching architecture and teaching urban design. And I'd always wanted to be an architect. So, I mean, from a very, very young age, I mean, I was quite shocked the other day. I looked at all my very, very first photos I took when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and they're all of buildings, you know, kind of ships taken at jaunty angles and bridges and mountains. And my parents occasionally show up very small in the foreground as kind of as scale, you know. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's something going on here. But actually, when I started actually practicing architecture and then ultimately teaching it, I had this very strong sense that there was something missing in the architectural discourse. And because I'd had this very early interest in buildings and love of buildings, I was then in this sort of, you know, a lockdown struggle. Sorry, lockdown is just a word that pops into your head now, but I mean a sort of a fierce struggle to think, well, what is it actually about buildings that I'm actually really interested in? And slowly and painfully over the course of a couple of decades, I came to realize that actually it's not really the buildings per se that I'm interested in, it's our relationship with them. So it's something squidgy in between us and buildings that doesn't have a name. And I guess I was looking for a way of bringing that sort of relationship into the architectural discourse. And that's when I had this light bulb moment, as I say, in the year 2000, which was the idea of describing a city through food. And I know exactly who I was talking to and where I was sitting. And I just remember, you know, getting instant chicken skin and literally my hair standing on end, because I just knew that was my thing. So food really was my way of introducing real life into, you know, the architectural discourse, I suppose. And Hungry City, that book I showed you earlier, that kind of popped out of that process 8 years later. So it kind of took 8 years to write that book. Actually, that seems to be how long it takes me to write a book. And I think you and I met very shortly after that, you know, and I was kind of following the sort of the vapor trail that writing a book can have. You know, I was going around the world and having amazing conversations about, you know, food and cities. And I mean, I should say that in that book, I follow the journey of food through the city, and I talk historically, but also in terms of the sort of current situation we find ourselves in, and ask about where we're going to go in the future in terms of this very, very big question of how you feed a city, which, by the way, it turns out is not an easy thing to do. Surprise, surprise. And of course, I immediately then thought, well, why haven't I ever thought about this before? You know, I was born and bred in London. I eat very well. You know, how come it never occurred to me to ask the question of where is this food coming from, and how does enough food for example, 30 million meals arrive in a city like London every day? I mean, that is a kind of almost miraculous thing that happens for every city on earth. So, you know, I guess my head was just absolutely exploding with ideas, and to try to come to actually answer the question you asked me, round about that time, I was, you know, of course, the irritating thing about writing a book is that you spend years perfecting it and getting all the arguments in order and tying it up with a beautiful bow. And you kind of send it out into the world thinking, you know, thank goodness that's done. And literally the next day you have a conversation with someone and they say something amazing. You think, darn it, I want that to be in the book, but it can't be.
Included it. Yep.
So irritating, your thinking moves on. And I guess that's roughly when we met. And you mentioned the doodle thing. I was actually doing a load of doodles, because so from writing Hungry City, what I guess I discovered or you know, studied and then realized, it's blindingly obvious really, is that food shapes our lives. In fact, that is the subtitle of the book, How Food Shapes Our Lives.
Yeah.
And you know, in ways that are visible to us. So obviously, you know that food shapes your body, or I'm certainly extremely aware of that fact, sadly.
Beautiful. No.
But also, you know, well, thank you. But I mean, you know, it shapes our habits, our politics, our economics, our cities, our landscapes, and so on. And I was trying to think, you know, roughly when we met, I guess, you know, what does one actually do with that information? And I was doing lots of drawings at the time because I am an architect. And this was the key drawing. This is the drawing from which Sitopia came. Beautiful. And it's not a great drawing or anything, but it just shows you how my thought processes were working at the time.
There's the earth and the table.
Yeah, so I drew a plate of food, a table around, the food, people around the table, and I started drawing arrows saying things like sharing, connecting, and so on. And then a cook figure, who made the food. So, nurturing, love, gratitude, question mark. So that kind of becomes the space of the home, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then where did the food come from? Well, the cook, who may be a mother figure or may not be, or a father indeed, got it from a place of exchange, so a market, a supermarket somewhere. So then you get kind of, knowledge, trust, exchange, economy, and so on. Where does the city, where does the market sit in the city?
Yeah.
Where does the city sit in the countryside? Where does the countryside sit in nature? I just drew a wiggly line representing the sea. It was a quick drawing. Where does that sit in the universe?
Well, it's like it's a napkin drawing a doodle, but that's how we brainstorm. I love it.
That's how we do it. And I mean, that was one of many drawings I did at the time, but that turned out to be the key drawing, because if you draw a section through it,
Yeah.
From food to the body, the home, society, city and country, nature and time.
It basically envelops all the chapters and the journey that
That's the
you
book
take us on.
structure.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it.
Yep.
And I mean, there's quite a lot I can say about that, but we can come back to that later. But
I'm sure we will. I'm
anyway,
positive.
so basically, since I met you, that's what I've been working on, and the book came out a couple of months ago, literally the week that the global pandemic was announced.
So not busy at all. I mean, seriously, there's a lot involved in that, and so I really know. I think one of the discussions we had on the bus too is I really want to get information out to people, and that's why I'm so glad about the podcast as quickly as possible. And a book and the research and all that goes into that is a lengthy process, but sometimes that real-time update of collective intelligence or that wisdom, people, not everyone can make it through a book as fast as maybe I can or others can, or there's not an audio version available to somehow disseminate that information quickly, or we just don't know about it. And so I am glad that we have this opportunity to kind of spark people to read and also to think and have this this dialogue. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I highly recommend Sitopia. It's a beautiful read and eye opener, and we're going to touch on a few things on that throughout our discussion. But I really want it to be a discussion where we both, if we need to drink, if we can kick back and
save the drama.
Save the drama for your llama. And have a drink, have something that we can just have a discussion with each other. And for most of that, I start out with a question, and this could probably already make it deep right off of the beginning. And that question is one that might spark something more. What does a world that works for everyone look like for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I mean, I guess because I am an architect, it's a question that I can't help asking myself anyway. That I think that's probably what architects are, is people who can't stop imagining kind of better worlds, and I mean, of course, I will answer that question through the lens of food, because I mean, something I realize I really have to explain and didn't explain is what the word Sitopia actually means.
Please do, yes.
It means food place. And it comes from the Greek word sitos for food and topos for place. And I invented this word as a practical food-based alternative to utopia. That's why I went Greek. And the reason I did that was because utopia, I discovered when I was researching it for Hungry City, it's a joke word. It can either mean a good place or no place. So it comes from the Greek ou, which means good, or eu, which memeans no. Yeah. And I remember finding this really depressing, because utopianism, if you like, is our greatest tradition of thinking in a joined up way about how we can live well, how we can lead good lives. And to discover that this place is good, but it doesn't exist, really, really upset me. And by then I'd been kind of researching Hungry City, I guess, for about 7 years. So I'd realized by that point that, oh, actually everything is shaped by food. So maybe, I can invent a word that means food place, and then we already live in it. So it does exist. It very much does exist. And so I rang up some friends of mine who, they're very, very leading thinkers in the ancient Greek world, as it were. They are alive in the ancient Greek world. And I just said, if you're an ancient Greek and you wanted a word that meant food place, what would it be? And they said, they gave me this word Sitopia because sitos was the Greek word for bread. So there's many Greek words for food, but it's the fundamental, the thing without which you can't live. So it actually really should be Sitotopia, but they said, well, no, Greek would have been crazy enough to make a word up that sounded that daft. So just make it Sitopia, which is what I did. But anyway, so food has become my lens, but my question has always been precisely the question just asked me. So what would a world look like that worked for everyone? Because Aristotle made the very important point that there is no good life without society. And I want to talk more about Aristotle if we have time, but he very importantly called us political animals, which I think is a phrase that people probably are aware of. And it's a beautiful one. And basically it tells you that there's a kind of dilemma at the heart of human life, because the fact that we're political means we need each other. It means basically we're social, so we need to gather together to be, more than the sum of our parts. But we're animals, which means we need nature, and we need the natural world. And of course, if we gather together too much in cities to be political, we're forgetting that half of our natures. So I find this a really, really interesting and useful term, because it sort of speaks of a duality. Now, what's beautiful about food as a way of thinking about, the world in complex ways and how we should live, is that it's the one thing that joins those two aspects of our natures beautifully together. So food is absolutely what binds us together. You could say that the human species evolved through the shared problem of how to eat. That's how we evolved language, economy, mutual cooperation, and so on. But of course, it's also the thing that joins us directly to the natural world. Because, if you have a plate of food in front of you, that is, I often say, an emissary from a landscape, somewhere that you don't know, but somewhere physical. So again, to come directly back to your question, what for me does a world look like which works for everyone? The metaphor that I've come up with is the shared meal. For me, that world is a world in which everybody eats well. And it's very interesting that we're very good at sharing food, actually. It's something, you could say a key element of our upbringing, our civilizing when we're children, is to learn how to share food, and as you know very well, if you go to a restaurant with some friends and you just go, oh, I'll have all the pie for myself, thanks very much, they wouldn't be your friends for very long. So, it's really, we're brilliant at sharing through food, and we're really bad at sharing through money. And that's a whole other question we might get onto. But anyway, so what does that world look like in which, if you like, everybody eats well? And again, I would argue that you can't eat well if you're not living well. So what does eating well actually mean? Well, it means that your food came from a place that was as rich after your food left it as it was before. So it's a flourishing landscape. It's a landscape that's being nurtured and that's being kind of, ecologically enriched through the way that we live in balance with it. So I guess it's a world in which, we live in balance with the two halves of our essential nature. So the landscapes that provide us with food are flourishing, and the societies in which we live are also flourishing. What does that mean? It means everyone has access to opportunity, and as I say, the sort of eating well is just a beautiful metaphor, because I can't eat well if I'm stressed. I can't eat well if I'm ill. I can't eat well if others around me are not eating well. I can't eat well if I'm destroying the planet or myself in the process. I can't eat well if I don't have access to good food, if I don't have money, if I don't have love. All the things that we need to live well are also things that we need to eat well. So, again, the vision, obviously I should draw it. In fact, I have drawn it. In a way, I've drawn a kind of, a sort of, well, actually, it probably isn't the best image. I've got
That's
other ones.
Beautiful.
But it's just a kind of slightly zhuzhed up version of the original sketch from the book.
Yeah.
But it is one in which, if you like, there's an order in which the shared meal is the heart of a society. There's love in the home, there's a balanced economy, there's a relationship between the city and the countryside.
Yeah.
You know, it all sits within nature, and the whole thing is sort of responds to earthly rhythms, basically.
I
So I
absolutely
guess
love it.
for each of us, that should be the sort of the food that we eat should resonate out into a world in which everybody else's world also it's in balance. And I guess that is a form of system, if you like, because of course, as you very, very kindly said at the introduction, I mean, I've never studied systems thinking, but thinking through food turns you into a systems thinker. You kind of can't help it.
It sure does.
So it's a world in balance, really, and it's an equitable world and a flourishing world. And, you know, give me longer and I can draw more of it for you. Actually, I should say, so one thing, which is that
Sure.
my wonderful friend Miriam Escofet, and I should have a better image of this somewhere, but anyway, maybe I do over here. She did a frontispiece for me in the book based on these ideas, which is really amazing.
I love that. That
And
is
it's called
such a
An Allegory of
beautiful image.
Sitopia.
Yeah.
And it's based on the same idea. I think you can, it also kind of goes from earth to sky. It also goes from our past to our future. So we go from, as it were, living in the forest to living in the city, but we still have to do it within the kind of, within earthly rhythms and, you know, within the context of time, nature and society, which, if you like, are the three enveloping you know, worlds that we sit in the middle of.
In the podcast, we'll link to your website, and also kind of hopefully so that people can go look at that on YouTube, or see if we can get out there and look at some of those images on
Wonderful.
that
Yes,
you're discussing. So I believe that it's absolutely fabulous, and that systems thinking, this systemic view of the world is really vital. And it's like once that light bulb goes on, it's hard to turn it back off. It's hard to think it differently. Brings me to a question I have is, I believe Hungry City spoke about this as well, but the beginning of cities, the beginning of building up what we were thinking and evolving into this, you know, Adam and Eve, a Garden of Eden, this utopia, this paradise, or even the beginning of cities, they all revolved around food. And, that's how they were built up. And Juan, I believe you agree with this, but I wanted to hear your take on this big history on how we got cities and built up, and then how this food place, which I strongly believe that cities are originally the start of, were food cities, now are no longer food cities or hungry cities. They're hungry cities, but they're a place, and we can discuss or debate this. Are cities a place that food comes to die? Have you ever heard of that, or have you ever thought?
I like that. I like that.
Because there's not a lot of food being generated in cities anymore.
Yeah. It's a really important point. By the way, I love the fact that just beyond your kind of head is the place where urbanity and farming co-evolved. So you can maybe work that out.
Yeah.
I mean, in the ancient Near East. Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, yeah, exactly. No, it's a really, really interesting and important question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I often sort of talk about how, you know, for most of human history, we lived in the larder, as I put it, which is basically we were hunter-gatherers. We just kind of followed the food around, which makes a lot of sense, actually. But you don't stay in one place, because basically once you've picked all the berries off one set of trees, you know, you move on to the next bit. You probably only come back every 3 years or something. So that's one way of living. It's a very effective way, but of course it can't sustain very many people. And what's really interesting about the evolution of urbanity is that it actually came on the back of the world's last great major climate crisis, which was the end of the last ice age around about 12,000 years ago. And just behind your head, a whole load of kind of really rich forest that people had been dwelling in, which in fact was the real life, you know, earthly paradise, if you like, the Garden of Eden, kind of started to thin out and turn more into savanna. And of course, there was a population explosion because the world was heating up, so people were living longer. So there was a major, major crisis. And gradually over the course of thousands of years, and of course nobody really knows, who did what when and stuff, but basically people began experimenting with eating grass, which there's never, probably had happened before in a very ad hoc way, but the actual saving of seeds and the planting of seeds and so on.
Yeah.
And again, just behind your head, in a sort of area called the Fertile Crescent, which was crescent shaped. I've got the map. You see, I naturally, because I'm an architect, I just need to see everything. But
I've told you this before, but this right here behind me is a map of the world, our planet, but it's also our kitchen. It's also the World Bank. It's where we get every resource off of, and this is our kitchen. It's not some physical individual spot. We've got the smorgasbord of kitchens and choices of what we can eat and get, and it's really beautiful.
Absolutely.
The question that as I ask you that is because when you think about farming in the countryside and where a lot of our fruits and vegetables come, whether they're shipped from locally or whether they're shipped from far away, basically we're taking the nutrients from those soils and from those farms and those proteins and vitamins and nutrients and minerals, and we're then shipping them to the cities, and we're not being very good stewards with that, what we're eating. That's why I said I think it's a place where food goes to die, because no longer does the food waste, or that which comes out after we eat or waste the food,
exactly right,
turn it into compost or enrich the soils in the cities that we live. It's the end cycle of that.
I just found my Fertile Crescent map, sorry. So that is what was behind Marc's head until just now when he moved.
Yeah.
This crescent-shaped area was critical. It's called the Fertile Crescent, obviously because it's crescent-shaped, but also because it's fertile. And it had the ancient antecedents to modern wheat and barley, etc., naturally growing. So people began, as you say, they began saving seeds, planting it, and then staying camping near the fields, because basically you've invested work in the land. So you're not going to wander off and let some deer come along and nibble it. You want to make sure that you're there to harvest it. So this idea of becoming static, making a home in a static place where you're also working on the land to produce food, is really the beginning of the co-evolution of farming and cities. And cities are really just advanced kind of farming communities that get kind of big and complex enough to be called cities effectively. But you're absolutely right. They're completely surrounded by the hinterland that feeds them. And in fact, this is what I call the urban paradox, and another sort of key element really of the duality that the political animalness of us kind of raises, is that, cities and countryside co-evolved, and all the early cities were city-states, which basically means, I often call it's the kind of the fried egg kind of model, which is basically the yolk of the egg is the urban bit and the white around it is the farmland. And that's absolutely a kind of ecological golden loop, so basically, the food was made just outside the city, it was consumed in the city, and then the waste was put back on the land again. So it was a sort of a semi-eternal cycle. I say semi-eternal because actually a lot of the nutrients for the those original cities in the Fertile Crescent actually came down these mighty rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates.
Yes.
That's hence the name Mesopotamia. It means between two rivers, basically. And they brought a lot of the nutrients with them. But absolutely in a historic city, until Rome, by the way, which is a whole other story, but most historic cities, it absolutely was this beautiful balance between city and countryside, which, by the way, most utopians attempt to replicate. So it's a very, very key idea in utopian thinking, is that you limit the size of the city so that it can effectively feed itself from its local hinterland. And that's a really critical idea.
Circular economy type of thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
This yolk or egg, is it Maria Mazzucata that does the donut economy or that type of thinking as well. But that brings me to really another thing. So you've actually kind of come up with another type of economy for us. So the Sitopian economy,
Yeah.
so to say. And I'd love to hear, maybe it's too soon, maybe we're getting too deep into that, but I'd love to hear more about that and have you explain what that thinking is for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the things about food, again, is that, because it connects everything, it is the great connector. I mean, I find every conversation in food, it just bounces all over the place the whole time, because that is its nature, so it's all connected. So it doesn't really matter what order we discuss this stuff in. The fact is that we're not going to run out of stuff to talk about, even if we give ourselves a week. So it's just not a problem. Anyway, so yes, I mean, so Sitopia means food place, as you know, and we live in one. We live in a world shaped by food. So, I mean, I think one of my most interesting early discoveries was when I was, again, being an architect, I was reading about the history of food in London, which is my home city, and it was saying, oh, well, meat was sold here and grain was sold there, and blah, blah, blah. And I was just thinking, I need to draw this. So I just got a map out, actually the Ogilvy map, which is from 1676, which is the first accurately drawn map of London. And I just started marking on where all these markets were. And I just went, this is so obvious. The grain's coming in by river because it's heavy and it's arriving at the two grain ports and it's trying to get up to Cornhill. The streets are named after food, And then Bread Street is where it was kind of being traded on the way. The fish is coming in. There's Fish Street. There's Friday Street where you bought your fish on a Friday because the eating of meat was forbidden. The animals are walking into the city. So they're coming in from up here. And they're sort of, again, they stop in a smooth field outside the city, which becomes Smithfield, which remains London's meat market today. So there's this incredibly powerful relationship between food and us that I certainly didn't realize until I had my light bulb moment. And now I just don't know how I could have missed it. And I often say, actually, that food is too big to see because literally we wouldn't exist without it. We wouldn't be here without it. And our cities, and landscapes are all so profoundly shaped by it that, it's almost like not seeing the air or something. It's everywhere. So we live in a Sitopia, in a food place. But here's the catch. We don't live in a good Sitopia. Why? Because we expect food to be cheap. Why do we expect food to be cheap? Well, again, this is a really long, interesting question, like they all are.
I want to hear it all.
Okay, well, in essence, if you think about, history, going back to those early cities I began to talk about, what's interesting when people start farming is that you very quickly get a new hierarchy developing between the feeders and the fed. So in hunter-gatherer societies, it's very egalitarian. That the best hunters are the most revered people in society because they're the most important, because they're bringing in the yummy stuff like meat and honey, and they get to eat the biggest share of the meal. So I often say that the shared meal is the earliest and best economy we've ever invented, and that's of course significant to the question you just asked me as well. When we get into farming societies, a sort of a new hierarchy develops where basically the temple keepers, sort of invent writing, so they're kind of getting one over everyone else. They're sort of, they're actually to do the farm accounts, interestingly. So the temple organizes the harvest, and they're sort of writing in, who's grown what and everything's brought into the temple and given to the gods. But there's a hierarchy developing between the people in the temple and the farmers. And it turns out that the farmers very rapidly are treated like second-class citizens, effectively. They don't have the power. And that's kind of stayed the same pretty much ever since, sadly. So why do we expect food to be cheap? Well, again, for most of civilized human history, i.e. sort of post cities, I'm not saying there aren't civilizations that pre-exist cities, but most of our experience is that the richer you are, the less you have to do with feeding yourself. So there's this kind of, this idea that to be a farmer or a chef or anything like that historically was low status, and to not have to think about your food was high status. So interestingly, what industrialization did was it allowed all of us to sort of start to actually behave like this, to kind of go, I'm far too busy to cook, so I'll just have a tin of something, So it panders to our inherited idea of social status, basically. And again, I mean, for most politicians, I'm sort of trying to summarize the contents of two books in one answer.
That's fine.
Nevertheless, there we go. I mean,
But
historically,
it's still, I mean, it's a complex thing. It's a systems thing. And so I want to
yeah,
hear
yeah.
it
But I
and
mean, there's
take the
many
time.
elements of why
Yeah,
do we
there's,
expect food to be cheap? Because if you think about what food is living things. I'll say this slowly. I'll calm down and say it slowly because it's really important. Food consists of living things that we kill so we can live, you know. So food is life. Literally, food is life. So the food we eat is the tomorrow version of us. It's the future us. And when you think about it that way, you think, well, how on earth could we expect this to be cheap? Because, you know, to cheapen food is to cheapen life, literally. So it's a kind of weird thing that we've got to. Why have we got here? And what I'm saying is that it's to do with this status idea, this idea that because the problem of how to eat is our oldest shared problem. We've evolved societies where, you know, as it were, the higher status you have, the more you rise above this necessity. You know, you're kind of too rich to care. And so what industrialization did is it made it possible by the mass production of food. And by the way, you know, it reduces the price that the average person pays for food by externalizing the true costs. And this is a really, really critical thing to remember. There is no such thing as cheap food, because remember, food is life. So we've created the illusion of cheap food by externalizing the true costs. And of course, that's everything from climate change, pollution, deforestation, lack of water, degradation of soils, diet-related disease, you can go on and on and on. But we, you know, who is we? But I mean, you know, the average consumer in the average industrial country quite has enjoyed not paying much for food and not thinking much about food. And that's kind of been seen as a high status, a desirable thing. And it's something that politicians have been very happy to go along with, because historically feeding the city was the hardest thing that any politician had to do, and they hated it. And there's a long history of, well, let's just say the French Revolution is not unrelated to the king's responsibility for feeding Paris. You know, you can join in the dots. So when, for the first time, industrialization made it possible to produce lots of food kind of quote unquote cheaply, so the railways made it possible to transport food really easily. It opened up areas in the New World to massive monocultural grain production, because trains made it possible to transport the grain into the cities for the first time. That was then fed to cows. That was the beginning of industrialized meat production, and that's an insanity we can also come on to. But, you know, it suited the politicians and it suited people. You know, it suited people to just kind of eat hamburgers and not think about it. So we've got here because something in us is, you know, sort of has inherited the idea that it's cool not to think about food. And of course, one of the ironies now is that, sorry, I still am going to come to your question, which is what is Sitopian economics? I'll go straight there now.
You're getting there because you need the background, you need to build up.
Indeed.
It's important to understand the connection.
So we've got to a point where, and there's another critical element of this, which I just briefly should get into, but that's another huge topic, which is the relationship between land and money. So just to say very briefly, you know, for most of urban history, the economy was essentially agrarian. It was based on the land, and lots of economists like Adam Smith and the physiocrats who were sort of trying to work out how to free up trade around Paris to feed Paris. They all acknowledge that, you know, all human wealth comes in from the land. But critically, they thought the land came for free, because they couldn't conceive of a time when there wouldn't be enough of it. You know, we're going back to sort of the middle of the 18th century. So John Locke also, who is basically the founder, there are two really founding fathers of modern, you know, liberal capitalism, Adam Smith and John Locke, both happen to come from the UK. That's non-coincidental as well. But, you know, John Locke, I mean, interestingly, because there's this puzzle of who owns the land, basically. And back in a time when everybody thought, you know, basically the earth was created by God for humans, to summarize it very rapidly, you know, they were puzzling over, well, so how do we divvy this thing up? You know, and what Locke said was that everybody had the right to own enough land to feed themselves, in essence. And, you know, he writes a very, I mean, you know, you read, I mean, what I find really interesting about reading these people, you know, the people whose names are still in our discourse, It's for a reason. If you go back to them and read their original writings, they're incredibly persuasive. These are people
Wonderful.
who are genuinely trying to puzzle out how we do this stuff from the ground up, as it were, literally from the ground up. So Locke says, you have the right to own as much land as it takes to feed yourself and your family, but no more, critically. Thomas Jefferson, as we know, I mean, very topical now, because of course he was a slave owner, and that's a whole yet another enormous topic we could come on to in our week-long discussion. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson was an agrarian, and he just sucked up John Locke, because of course in America at the time there was a sensation that there was just infinite land for everyone. Of course, there's the minor issue of the Native Americans who had to be got out of the way for this to be the case, but nevertheless, again, another huge issue. But he adopted this, this idea, sort of freedom, individuality, and the pursuit of happiness, which is basically Locke's agrarian vision of a free society, gets adopted into the American Constitution. But the critical thing that happens, and this is where I am going to come back to Sitopian economics, is that slowly but surreptitiously, the land, which is the basis of Locke's vision, gets replaced with money. So, and again, you can see why. I mean, basically, markets were evolving at the time, capitalism was evolving at the time, and it was the beginning of the sort of, the invention of modern banking, which is all to do with, anyway, I mean, let's not go there at the moment, but, essentially money behaves in a very different way from land. Land stays in one place and is limited. Money doesn't exist and is unlimited. So kind of where we've got to is that we have an ideology of freedom and sharing that was based on land and is now based on money. And the trouble is that basically we still need access to land in order to flourish. I mean, I know this is something that you do a lot of work on, and I'm really, really interested to hear more about. But but because money sort of gives the appearance of equality, but actually doesn't behave at all like land, i.e., basically, if you've got money, you get more money. It doesn't stay static at all. Rich people get richer and poor people get poorer in a free market. So, I mean, that's, as we've seen for the last 40 years, particularly in the neoliberal countries like the UK and the US, we've just seen massive increase in inequality. So we have a value system in which the most valuable thing in our lives, which is food, and I'll just, again, pause on that because, I sometimes I sort of say this to an audience, I see people kind of going, that's not the most valuable thing in our lives. And I'm sort of saying, we need love as well, but I mean, food's the one thing that we actually have to do work to produce, without which we die. So there's an inherent value to food. And in fact, Adam Smith talks about this. So we've got to a point where the most valuable thing in our lives, which is food, which Locke based his vision of a free society on, by the way, because it's an agrarian vision. So the reason you have land is so you can feed yourself, basically. So we don't value this. We think food is cheap, we've externalized the true cost, and we think value resides in money, which doesn't exist. So very simply, having said 20 minutes of expurgation, Sitopian economics is the idea that we reinvest value in food. So we stick value back where it belongs, which is in the stuff that we all need in order to live. So it's an internalizing the true cost of food as the proposal. This would mean, by the way, that artisanal, organically produced food would stay the same cost, because it's the only food we currently eat that already has its true costs internalized. And shall we say, meat raised in sort of livestock, CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, raised on soybeans, kind of harvested on land from recently cleared Amazonian rainforest, would be totally unaffordable, because it is. It would cost. In fact, there was a study done. The Indian Science of the Environment did a study on what a hamburger made from precisely that kind of meat would cost, and they said it should cost $200. Putting in, just
all the external costs, the true costs, the total environmental costs.
Exactly. So that's the proposal. Of course, because my vision of a good society is one in which everybody eats well. This also means you need a new economics. In other words, you need a new taxation system, because you can't afford to have people who can't afford to eat this good food. So again, you start to address this crazy money-based, if you're rich, you get richer thing. And it really effectively puts value back in the land, ultimately.
That's the amazing thing about this systems thinking and this overview perspective, this cosmic perspective of the full picture. Brings me back to when we first met in Milan in Italy, and there, matter of fact, I mentioned it to you on the bus, but I spoke about that. The world's oldest, most successful, longest running economy is an agrarian society. It's an agrarian economy, and it's been um, fabulous success up until last couple hundred years, and then it started to go around and have a lot of effects on human health and on our environment. It's also the beginning when we started impacting the environment by moving rocks and cutting down trees and tilling up soil and putting carbon in the atmosphere through farming. It's also the least digitized and least innovative industries or in systems in the entire world. I mean, we've had 5 to 6 mentionable innovations, and they're not very great. They haven't helped us into the next decade or into to get us into the future, not only feeding humanity, but to where we need to be to kind of live within planetary boundaries. And so you touched upon all that in your explanation of this Sitopian economics. And I think it's very fitting that not only can it be the biggest impact on our environment, human health, but it can also be the biggest drawdown or solution. And that's why I'm, extremely excited about, your thoughts and your tie set. There's a big factor that you mentioned a couple of times in there, but it's almost too big to go into, is there's a little bit about the sharing economy and the sharing aspect that goes into that model as well. The thing that I mentioned on the bus is and the number has changed since. So back then it was, I think, the agriculture, seafood, food, and beverage industry worldwide was somewhere around 13 trillion US dollars at that time, and had a shadow economy of $2 trillion. That since has changed. We're like way up in the 23 trillions globally, and the shadow economy is at least 3 trillion now. For people who eat out of the house 3 times a day in Asia and India and in different parts of the world, they don't even have a kitchen, and they're not paying with credit cards or traceability. It's cash and go, and they're not filing taxes, and there's just a whole nother sub economy that's really driving around the world. And so it's something it's ready for an overhaul, but I don't think everybody has connected the dots yet that it is our energy source. It's a caloric intake. We need those calories to help our body regulate temperature so that we can maintain, walk, move, function. And without that, we're dead. We're done for. And we've made, and this occurred in 2008. And I don't know if you have some thoughts or comments around this kind of bringing together what you said, but in 2008, the entire world shifted their investments in technology and real estate and things, the majority of those into the food systems. And it's one that since 2008 has grown minimum $1 trillion every year, $99 billion a year in Europe alone, every year consistently. And during this time of COVID, of the pandemic, we had a lot of problems. There was a lot of things through political decisions and others around food, but it still flourished and thrived. And I just wish everybody would have ran to the fresh produce department during this instead of to the toilet paper aisles and to the non-perishable items.
The canned tomatoes. I mean, okay, so there's about 18 things you mentioned there connected that I would love to try to tie together, and indeed can do, but I mean, that's why you write books, I guess, because you know, these things are so complex, but you can pull them all together in one place. And I mean, again, just to restate, the beauty of food is that, you know, life and its complexity, and economics and politics can get very abstract, and you just get lost in numbers, and it's just, what does it all mean? And again, I'm a simple soul, really. I like to sort of feel something and see something and see it on the ground. And, you know, really going back to your initial question of, you know, what would the world look like that worked for everyone? You know, for me, it's a world where, you know, kind of weirdly, a lot of the things that are available during lockdown are sort of what we build our lives around. So that sounds a little bit perverse, but I mean, basically, one of the things that I've come to believe very, very strongly, and it goes back to your question that I realize now I didn't really properly answer. You said, are cities places where food comes to die? You know, to a certain extent, that is true, because we don't recycle the nutrients which we should be doing. Some of them we do recycle, but not nearly enough. So yes, to a certain extent, that is true, but that needs to change. But also, I mean, I think another of the sort of sicknesses that we suffer from now is that we don't have either a conception of a good life or a good politics or a good economy that is really based around a vision of a good life that actually makes people happy. Now, what's interesting, and again, I mean, I wrote in my book about the Stoics in my final chapter, which is about time. You know, I love the Stoics because, I mean, by the way, they get a really bad rap. I mean, you say Stoic to people and people imagine some miserable geezer who sort of, you know, takes everything on the chin and never reacts. Actually, they're totally not about that at all. They're actually about saying they're party people. They're about carpe diem, live for the moment, because their basic message is you're going to die someday. That's an inevitability. So get over it. And now live your life as if every day was your last, because, you know, it's very, very true that it's when we're close to death, or we think we might be close to death, that we really realize what we value in life. And what we value is simple stuff. It's spending time with our loved ones. It's being in our homes. It's access to nature. You know, it's just simple, everyday pleasures. And I think what's ironic and interesting, but also potentially really powerful about COVID is that under lockdown, people have got time back. You know, it's the one thing that our modern lives just didn't legislate for at all. And yeah, you know, we have many restrictions on our freedom, but on the other hand, so many people are going, wow, you know, it's actually quite nice spending time with my kids and baking bread with them. And, you know, and I know this isn't everyone, by the way. I do know there's a big section of society who are having a horrible time in lockdown and increasing inequality and uncertainty. But I nevertheless think that route of a good life based in simple stuff, you know, being close to friends, having time, and crucially, and here's where the city conversation comes back again, making stuff. And doing meaningful stuff. So to be happy as humans, we need to get up every day and know that there's something meaningful that we're going to do before we go to bed again. You know, in other words, and it can be, you know, looking after your kids. It can be mending a piece of furniture. It can be growing potatoes. It could be helping somebody, you know, kind of helping somebody else to do those things they can't do, caring. It doesn't matter, but it has to be meaningful. And I think the problem with the economy that we have, the capitalist economy, is that it turns us all into consumers. The ideal capitalist model is that the cost of labor is zero. And again, a complicated conversation, but I mean, that's us. You know, if I'm making, let's say, stick with making furniture, you know, I mean, making furniture can be a really beautiful thing to do. You know, you work with wonderful materials, you have a client, you might even make a chair to measure them or something, or, you know, according to your own design or their design, you're working with wood or whatever it is. It can be beautiful. That's not how most furniture gets made. Most furniture is churned out by a machine. I mean, I found it really interesting that one of the first things that happened when non-essential shops were opened in the UK is people started queuing to get into IKEA. There was a 4-hour queue to get into IKEA to buy, you know, kind of bits of plywood that stick together. I mean, it's just weird. I mean, surely, you know, well, in any previous era, people would have been able to make most of the stuff that IKEA sells themselves, you know, and it's just a total different level of satisfaction. So anyway, I'm going off on a whole load of connected things again, but I mean, just to say that,
I think what you're touching on is that, I mean, we used to have this maker ability. We used to have this do it yourself. We used to have the empowerment or the tools to be able to do those things ourselves. And now we've disconnected ourselves. We've lost that ability, and it's really important. It doesn't matter if you live in an apartment in a city or not, a mega city either. You can still have that kind of resilience, that
Exactly.
self-sustain ability to cook. I mean, cooking went up during the
Yeah,
pandemic. I think
massively.
that's fabulous,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
I don't know how good the cooking was, but I heard I
Well,
heard some
presumably it was
positive
getting
things.
better as it went along, frankly. You
Yeah,
know, people are actually doing it, and that's how you
learning by
learn.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, food, you know, always comes back to food, because food is the one thing that it's just a no-brainer that, you know, every day we have to eat. It's the one thing we have to consume every day. So why not make that a pleasure? I mean, going back to the Stoics again, I mean, the Stoics were great, very skillful at getting pleasure out of necessity. You know, because if you enjoy the stuff you have to do, you're in win-win territory, you know. And actually, if that is what we based our economy on, rather than saying everybody's aspiration is to have 8 cars and to go abroad 20 times a year, you know, I mean, just frankly, stuff that as we keep reading doesn't make you happy anyway. You know, if we aimed at everyone having a decent home, a decent job, and that's a whole other massive conversation, but food is a big part of it, you know, a loving, supportive environment, you know, and the possibility of being a producer as well as a consumer, then you're starting to get somewhere towards, you know, my vision of a flourishing economy. And it is very much about being in a place. And that doesn't mean stuck in a place. I mean, I think one thing that Zoom's taught us is that we don't have to be stuck anywhere anymore, because we can just hop online and, you know, and chat to anyone all around the world. But I do think it's about, you know, as you say, that world resilience is really important. Local resilience actually means knowing your territory. And again, you know, under lockdown, it's amazing how many, you know, people are tweeting, gosh, you know, I've never noticed my local park before, because I'm usually running past it to get a train to go to work, but it's really beautiful. And I've just, for the first time in my life, watched a tree slowly coming into blossom during spring, and it's actually rather moving and beautiful. You know, these are the things that make us happy, and these are the things that don't even sit inside, you know, the GDP, but they are actually the essence of a good life. So I think, you know, again, food is a portal to so many of those things that, you know, we need to base our new zero carbon 21st century happy lives around.
The other thing that you said about Locke, and there's the Global Footprint organization that regulates our Earth Overshoot Day
Yeah.
every year. That, you know, this is the planetary boundaries, and are we living within the resources of our planet? Are we overshooting those resources? And last year, Earth Overshoot Day was July 29th. This year, with the pandemic, they just came out this week. Matter of fact, I believe it was Monday or Tuesday, with the new date, and it's August 22nd. So with this pause and this reset, we've gained almost what, 32 days now from last year on this resource overshoot, because that goes back to what Locke was kind of saying. So everybody gets land to make their own food, to be kind of off the grid. Well, the concept of this Earth Overshoot Day and this is based upon a global hectare that is replicable for you to live a long, healthy lifestyle. So if you have 1.6 global hectares, which is the current number, you could produce enough food, water, have shelter, security that you need to live 80 or older, if you have good stewardship over that land, that global hectare. But per person today, by August 22nd, we've overshot those resources, because per person on a global average, we're using 2.87 something, or even higher, global hectares per person. And that's that deficit, that resource overshoot. And that would begin calculated around the 70s, but I believe it's based off of not only systems dynamic modeling, systems thinking from Don Meadows and the limits to growth, but it's also based upon Locke and that. And I like that, that we kind of connect ourselves to an inalienable right to have our energy and resources and think of new economic models. So I absolutely believe that we should not go back to the way it was, and that we should have more than a reset and more than the new normal, that we should really revamp our systems, our economic models, the way we live, the way we think about food, and to have that pause to think about the world that we're living on. The one big question that I mentioned quite a bit is called the burning question, WTF, and it's not a swear word. It's what's the future if we continue this model that we've been operating on the past 20 years, past 50 years, and we push that model out to the future. What does that future look like? It's the current path that we've been on for many years. It doesn't look very good in the future.
No, it looks terrible.
Yeah,
I mean, it's already looking terrible. I mean, forget the future, just look at now. Now's not good. So we totally have to change trajectory. And I mean, I really do believe, I mean, I know COVID's been a tragedy for many people and it's bringing a lot of hardship, but it is probably the biggest opportunity we're ever going to have to, as you say, do the great reset. And it really, really needs doing. And one of the beautiful things about COVID is that it is showing us the way in many respects, as you say. I mean, it's very, very interesting that lots of people who would have been on 8 business trips, you know, back and forth the Atlantic in the last 3 months, saying, hey, I can just sit in my pajamas and do this. Why the hell was I flying? You know, and so many things like that. So, I mean, it really is, I've slightly given up expecting vision from our politicians, tragically. Well, I think down in New Zealand, they have a few kind of politicians who know what they're doing, but, you know, in a way, it's up to people like us. So we spend our time thinking about how the world could be, to actually say, look, this is how it could be from here onwards. And it's not that trajectory we were going on. In fact, it's kind of a bit like this. It's not back down where we were, but it's totally, in many ways, the opposite. And again, for me, it comes down to asking the key question, which is, what is a good life? And what does that look like in the 21st century? Going back to Aristotle, that can't be just a good life for me. It has to be a good life for you too. And it has to be a good life for all the other earthlings that we share the planet with. So that means non-humans. So if you start from that position and then you say, okay, and it has to be zero carbon, you know, ultimately we're working towards zero carbon, you know, it has to be in balance with nature and in balance with society. So where's all the low-hanging fruit here? You know, where's all the stuff that we can easily do? Well, lo and behold, we're doing a lot of it right now, you know, where the government is paying people not to work. That's interesting. That's a bit like universal basic income came in by mistake. Interesting. You know, we're taking homeless people off the streets and giving them a shelter. Good move. You know, we're saying, you know, you need a lot more time to be with your family. Fantastic. You know, and then why don't we design a politics and an economics and a physical framework that supports that kind of life? Because, you know, amazingly in the UK, there was a study done a couple of weeks ago about, you know, what people thought about lockdown and so on. Only 9% of people want life to go back the way it was before. That's incredible to me. And that's an amazing political opportunity, you know. And I think, I mean, my question, by the way, that the way I frame it is which is similar to yours, is what does a landscape for human flourishing look like? You know, because I think critically we need land reform, and it does come back to land. And I think, you know, the idea of one's global hectare is really, really important, because it's a very clear way of visualizing the fact that you don't exist in a vacuum. You know, you do draw resources from the natural world, but you have to put resources back as well. And that means we need people working on the land. It means that this crazy thing that, you know, 100 years ago, 50% of Americans were farmers, and now I think 2% are, and it's going down the whole time, you know, so nobody farms anymore. This is really weird. I mean, lots of people are actually natural farmers. They want to be outdoors. They want to work with nature. They're drawn to it, but very few people can farm, partly because we won't pay enough for the food that they produce, and B, because they can't get access to land. But it seems to me that, you know, my vision anyway of a landscape for human flourishing, as I said before, it answers this dualism in us of being political animals. I mean, historically, it's very interesting to me that rich people have always had a place in town and a place in the country. Why is that? Because we need both. Duh, you know. So we need to be designing to give people that, and it can be at any scale. By the way, you know, it can be at the scale of. So I call it maximizing the urban-rural interface. So the sort of, it's a permacultural idea actually, where the two worlds that we need meet is where the ideal place is for most of us to live. So you can create that at any scale. You know, it can be flats with balconies where you can grow food. It can be, you know, housing estates with allotments and community orchards. It can be cities designed to be strongly connected to their region. You know, it can be any shape, doesn't really matter, but that basic concept that we need society and we need nature. And if we provide for that, and by the way, this is also interestingly an anarchist idea, which we could also get into. I mean, if it just gets more and more interesting.
Yeah.
You know, when you sort of, as I say, when you go to the source material and you realize that, you know,
well, I'm an activist, so that's not far away from.
Yeah, indeed. But I mean, anarchism is really just a sort of, it's many things, of course, because it's anarchism. But I mean, one of the things that it is it's saying, let's design society around giving people the opportunity to be fully fledged humans. You know, and what capitalism does is it reduces you, famously Adam Smith even talks about it, you know, to being the person who puts the heads on the pins. You know, it reduces you to being a tiny cog in the wealth producing machine. Whereas anarchy says, and Peter Kropotkin in particular talks about this, he says, well, I don't want to be someone who puts the head on a pin all day, thanks. I'd rather, you know, kind of write poetry in the morning and grow potatoes in the afternoon, you know, or make a chair. You know, so why don't we design a society where that is the ultimate goal, that everybody has rich opportunity to flourish? And I'm really, really drawn to that idea. And again, you know, where food takes you is precisely there, because food, as I said, it animates this dualism in us of needing society and nature. And if you put food at the heart of your thinking, you kind of naturally come up with, you know, a kind of modern version of a sort of a 14th century Italian hill town, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, you come up with something like that. And as I say, it's no accident that this kind of, going back to our fried egg of earlier, this intense blob of urbanity with plenty of culture going on, but very close to beautiful farmland, that's very lovingly tended, because the whole idea is that this thing is going to last forever. Is, you know, to me, fairly close to an ideal, you know, and of course it doesn't have to have that form, it doesn't have to be in Italy, but it helps. So,
I mean,
but, you know,
Italy's beautiful, but that's a great example with Italy, because yes, it's a great place for food, wonderful, beautiful people, great farmlands. I go there every year to a place called H Farm close to Venice, which is like a kibbutz and entrepreneurial accelerator place. It's fabulous. But their systems there are failing them. Their healthcare systems, the unhealthy amount of people that live in Italy, the age and their political systems are kind of, and then even to go back further with this whole anarchy thing, you know, we say, well, we get the right to vote and we can create the politicians and systems that we want. It's just not true. The Trumpocalypses, the Bolsonaros, the Shays, the Putins, the Duartes, the Erdogans, they were all voted in. You know, whether it was fair or right, or that's another debate. That's a whole nother
it is
can of worms to open up. But they got into power, they got into their political position, and those systems, those people are failing us. And so, no, a vote, and Trump didn't even win the popular vote; he won the electoral college. So, by saying that by voting and use your dollars to vote is going to fix it, I don't think that's the way. And so, I had an interesting conversation yesterday with a famous futurist and emerging technologist, and it was specifically about, you know, how can we get a trustless system, a new economic model, and something into place. And sadly to say, I wasn't too excited about his answer, but he said, you know, we need to bring it down to each individual's, to be able to measure their carbon footprint and what impact they have. And this goes to what you were just saying about the true cost and true value and the impact. There are some externalities that are unseen, they're hidden, they're almost part of this shadow economy that I have no control over. I have a control over a certain amount of my impact on this world and this footprint. But if I live in an apartment building, well, if my landlord chooses to have my building not be on renewable energy and with good passive building things, then they control a little bit of my impact. And if my infrastructure of my city or community I live in has a poor garbage system or a poor sanitation system, then they're affecting my global impact on the world as well, my carbon footprint, and many other impacts that I have on the environment. So yes, there's a lot that I can control and take back into my hands and be resilient and self-sufficient. But some of those politics and those systems in place are really failing us. They're not up to date with the times.
Yeah, I mean, they're totally failing us. And I mean, you know, I think I write about this in the book as well. I mean, I think the recent rise of populism, particularly in the UK and the US, but obviously elsewhere as well. You mentioned Bolsonaro and Erdogan, and there's loads of them. Basically, that is because the capitalist vision has now failed. It's over, you know, because what we've seen, particularly in the last 40 years, with the complete releasing, you know, the sort of reduction in sort of deregulation of everything, if you like, and the stripping out of the kind of the welfare state, particularly in the UK and the US, has been, you know, that just, as I said earlier, money just accumulates. So if you're rich, you get richer, and if you're not rich, stuff you. So we got to that point, and then of course the 2008, you know, financial crash meant that, you know, what was already a sort of pretty failing system just had 10 years of austerity dobbed on the top of it, and of course, you know, the idiot governments basically just punished the poor people. So it got to a real crisis point just before COVID. And the Brexit vote in the UK and voting in Trump, I mean, both Trump and you know, Boris and his henchmen basically just lied their way to power. And they used, as you know, they took over social media. Unfortunately, these days, a lot of people get their information from social media, and basically it's a propaganda machine. And they just promised total fantasy stuff. They said, vote for us and we'll make it all okay. I think on both sides of the Atlantic, people are discovering that was a mistake. I certainly didn't vote for Boris or for Brexit, but, you know, and we're now in COVID. So, I mean, it's really interesting. I really, really hope that neither of those kind of mop-headed politicians are going to make it, you know, win the next election. I fervently hope that. But also what we need, and we desperately needed before as well, was a new political vision. And as I said, I mean, political vision and a vision of a good life is basically the same thing, but amazingly, you wouldn't know it because I almost never hear politicians talking about their idea of a good life. I just don't hear political vision of that sort being spoken about in Parliament, which amazes me. It's all about, you know, jobs and taxes and the NHS, but what about what's going to make us happy? You know, so I think now is an amazing opportunity to put that kind of vision together. And for me, land reform has to be at the heart of it, and go directly to your point about agency. I mean, one of the things that makes people feel happy is engagement and a sense of agency. And again, under COVID, we're seeing the resurrection of neighborhoods, you know, because people are, you know, they're going on WhatsApp groups and they're finding out which of their neighbors need their shopping done for them, and they're baking bread. I mean, you know, my neighbor brought me courgette bread or cake or something. Anyway, I don't know what it was. It was really delicious. She's never done that before. You know, but it was just like, oh, I've just made some cake. Can I bring it over? And it's like, okay. So this is incredible. And this is what, you know, we evolved as in groups, in bands. We're tribal animals. You know, we like to belong to a kind of clan and to a family. And, you know, what modernity has done is it's split up the nuclear family and it's scattered it. You know, so our family is now online and they're all over the world, and, you know, it's disparate. But we actually need that in a physical place as well. So my vision, again, I mean, it's really interesting if you read Ebenezer Howard. So Ebenezer Howard invented the Garden City. He did it just over 100 years ago, and facing very, very similar problems to the one we face now. So there was a massive rural depression, which basically means a depression, and people were crowding into the cities and living in slums. There's very little work, and he was actually saying, how could we re-inject the rural economy? And that's really what the Garden City was trying to do. And his two key influences were Peter Kropotkin, who wrote this book called Fields, Factories and Workshops, and this idea that you have a sort of patchwork landscape, that where it's not just all the industries in the city, all the power and all the money, and then the landscape's just farms, but actually you bring some of that into the landscape, and therefore people can, as I said, lead these rich lives where you do a bit of industry and a bit of agrarianism and a bit of poetry and whatever you like. So it's a kind of redistribution of the density of urbanity into other spaces. So that's one idea. The other idea was Henry George, who's this very influential, very, very world famous actually, in the late 19th century American economist, who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And it was all about the fact that basically when the railways got built, people who happened to own land by the railways got rich by doing nothing. And he said, this is wrong, because a railway is for everyone and land is for everyone. So we need to actually say that everyone owns the land. And then if a bit gets more valuable because somebody happens to build a railway next to it, then the whole community benefits. So it basically boils down into a land value tax. And so that's the idea that everybody, and again, it goes back to Locke and so on, the idea that we need access to land. We do, if the government came along to me and said, here's a kind of a hectare of land in Wiltshire, would you like to do something with it? I would leap at that. I probably wouldn't go and live there, but I'd love to, as it were, do a deal with a farmer who would grow food directly for me, and I might build a little house there. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, land is just, it is wealth.
Yes, it is.
It is wealth. That hasn't changed. And, a vision where everybody has access to land. They have access to, and land in itself implies home and work. And again, I mean, this is historically, used to be literally the case, and now there's some quite interesting examples. For example, just east of Amsterdam at the moment in Almere, which is the sort of fastest growing city in the Netherlands, there are these interesting experiment by a group of architects called MVRDV, where they're basically saying you can have a chunk of land, and you can do anything you like on it, but you've got to grow food. So they're kind of building this kind of Kropotkian landscape, actually, and it's really popular. I mean,
Wow.
people are really, it looks a bit chaotic because everyone's building their own houses their own way they like. But, if they don't want to farm, they're getting somebody else in to farm. There are professional farmers who are kind of going around doing everybody's little patches, and it's hugely popular. In fact, the one problem is they didn't get the land pricing structures right, so it's now getting really expensive, because it's really popular. So, we have to sort that out. But I mean, the principle is that people are gagging for this. They're just the freedom, the opportunity. And it's just another vision. It's the kind of the opposite vision, if you like, from the way we were going before. And I think there's a lot of really interesting mileage in it that we could explore.
There's so much mileage in it. And if we can connect ourselves with that land, with the earth, with that, it really ties to food. The reason we want the land is so that we can make food and have a place of security to live and flourish and create our own utopias, instead of living in these zoos, these human zoos that we live in. We're going to wrap it up, but I have two longer questions I would like to discuss, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One is this kind of it's a dual part question. What's your favorite food, and what's your favorite food to cook for people?
Yeah, I love food. I'm one of these people. I mean, I'm quite glad that Zoom World cuts you off round about here, because I mean, I'm always slightly on the cuddly side, shall we say, because I just love eating. It fills
Very
me
healthy.
with great joy. Probably if you left me alone with a really good bread and really good butter, I could just survive on that for the rest of my life. I mean, there is no better food really for me. So I might just rest with that. But when you ask the question, what do I make for other people? I love showing my love by cooking for people. And I mean, interestingly, recently, I mean, only over the last few years, maybe I think this is my 5th year. I live in London, as you can probably see. And by the way, I should also say I love London and I love cities. I'm not anti-urban at all, but I do think we need both. And 4 years ago, I was very lucky that there's a flat roof on the way up to my flat, and I got hold of this space. I got access to this space, and I've started growing food on it. I mean, kind of other stuff as well, but actually not really much. I think it's mostly herbs. And crucially, up a south-facing wall, I grow these enormous Danish pickling cucumbers, and there is a reason for this. They're called Asia. I'm just wondering if I actually can't show you pictures at the moment. But anyway, well, I could actually go and get you some because I have some in the kitchen here. This is the pickled version. So anyway, they're kind of enormous, marrow-like.
Beautiful.
And this is I grow about 10 kilos a year and I pickle them, and they're so delicious.
Can you turn it on the side just a little bit? Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Wow.
I mean, they're so delicious. They're, as I say, that the fruit are up to 2 kilos. They're like marrows, but they're actually cucumbers. They got really dense but fragrant flesh. They're like super cucumbers, and on their way to being melons in texture and very crunchy.
Wow.
They're just so delicious. So I grow these things. I've probably got now about kind of 30 friends in London who are slightly addicted to them, and of course you can't buy them in London because they're Danish. Yeah. So I have a supply chain of people going, yeah, when are the ASIO going to be ready and everything, and they're delicious with anything, with cheese, with meats, with pâtés and stuff like that. But I mean, or you just nibble them on their own.
Wonderful snack, yeah.
So I love that because it's the first time I've actually grown stuff and then processed it and then been able to serve it for people. So that gives me incredible joy, I have to say. And, I do think we show our love for people by obviously looking after them in many ways, but I think feeding someone is the most, in a way, intimate and fundamental you can do with someone who you're not actually related to, because you are feeding, by giving them food, you are, as I say, creating the future them. I mean, this slightly blows your mind, but we are made of the food we eat, literally. I mean, it's kind of obvious when you think about it. So when you're feeding someone, you're not just giving them something nice, you're actually creating a part of the future them, which is just a mind-blowing thought. But
we're aligned. I'm totally with you. I believe that and agree. So food truly can fix it. As I mentioned before, food is not only the universal connector, it is the best way to draw down and fix it. Now, there's always that yin and that yang, or that balance. There's a way to do it horrifically wrong and to the destruction of human health and planet. And there's a way to do it fabulously right, to really change and fix how we live and eat and how we're healthy and have that life. And you, as you said so eloquently, we are what we eat, and what we eat, if we defines our life as well. If we're eating bad, we're probably living pretty bad, or we're pretty miserable, and almost vice versa. So you don't see somebody who's in utopia and living this fabulous life that is eating unhealthy and poorly.
Because eating badly is not only affecting you, it's affecting landscapes, it's affecting humans, it's affecting animals, life forms that you don't even see. It's this kind of physical version of Aristotle's point, that a good life is always social. It's never just about you. It has to reflect out into the world as well.
And that goes to the sharing that you discussed as well as on Sitopian Economy and that. I totally agree. The last question that I have for you to wrap this up is, if you could give everybody who's listening not only words of wisdom, but what the biggest thing, the takeaway that they should have, not only from your book, but from you. If you could go around and give one message to each individual on earth that would forever change their life, empower them, impact them to look and see or take action themselves, what would that message be?
Probably just value food. I mean, just those two things, because, you know, you and I've now been talking very, very happily for an hour and a half, and I think people can probably tell we could easily carry on for another several days. So there's so much in food, but when you remember that, as I said earlier, food is living things that we kill so we can live. So food is life. So just to get that in your head, food is precious, it's sacred, it's also political, it's economic, it's about love. You know, it's all of the things that really, really matter in the world. It's the most precious, valuable, beautiful thing in our lives. So see food, think through food, value food, and create a beautiful world through food. And I call that Sitopia, but you can call it anything you like. We can build a beautiful world by understanding and thinking through and valuing food, showing our love through food.
Carolyn, thank you so much. It's been a sheer pleasure, and I would like to repeat it again sometime soon. As you say, we can talk forever. I also have a funny feeling that about 5 other book topics or books are coming out of this discussion, or that you could write them. So I know that you're wise beyond your years, and you could really bring a lot of great reading and wisdom to the world. And I thank you for that. And I hope we see each other soon. Thank you very much.
I really hope so too. It's been a great, great pleasure. And I just have to say that next time we meet, I'm going to have some of these.
Yeah.
Because we need to eat together.
Drunken cucumbers, but I love cucumbers. Yeah, I love it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. And I look forward to the next time. And thanks to everyone for listening, if you're still listening.
You bet they are. Thanks.